Okay. What I want to start with is just a quick and very impressionistic historical overview to try and put sort of political dissent in our own time in historical perspective. The term that is often used by historians to characterize these kinds of movements is populism, meaning literally sort of the people. And this, of course, is deeply embedded, as we saw in the first couple of sessions of our class, in our founding documents. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution create a form of government which, in a variety of ways, is extraordinarily suspicious of centralized power. So you have checks and balances through the judicial system. You have what is, by international standards, a sort of upside-down federal system in which most of the powers, at least constitutionally, are reserved to the states. And you have the staggering of legislative elections. Again, to try and to sort of maximize that popular impact. And of course, we know through the course of our history since then that ours is a political culture which is notoriously suspicious of other ways of organizing government. Think of the sort of founding suspicion of European monarchies coming out of not only the battle with King George, but also the American response to the French Revolution early on. Think of the American response to totalitarianism on the left and the right, most markedly in the World War II era and after. And think of the suspicions, broadly speaking, in our political culture of European forms of social democracy. One thing we've seen recently in the response to the Affordable Care Act. I think it's important to recognize that American populist movements have always been animated by a sort of profound outrage and suspicion of political and or economic elites. These are accused, in various times and in various forms of ignoring, corrupting, or betraying some core American values. We can start by going back to the 1890s, at a time when populism really earned its name in the upper and lower case. Here we have a cartoon. We looked at a version of this earlier. The snake is labeled Monopoly. It's threatening Lady Liberty in the foreground. Its tail is wrapped around the Capitol dome in the background. This is a kind of image, I think, that would be equally at home on a Tea Party bumper sticker or on a sign in Zuccotti Park. Populism at the end of the 19th century was really, in a sense, a sort of multifaceted response to the threat posed by, in some respects, the growing power of the federal government, in some respects, the growing power of corporations, and particularly, as the populists like to label them, trusts or monopolies. Animated very much by this profound sense of injustice in the face of inequality. By, again, these sort of images of kingly corporations or government, a damning representation in the American context. The constant sort of imagery and rhetoric of the people versus the interest. Captured, again, notice the American imagery in this campaign flyer for William Jennings Bryan, who ran on the populist ticket in 1892 and again in 1896. And famously declared, as this magazine cover portrays, that he would not see the people's interests crucified on a cross of gold, by which he combined sort of religious imagery with his battle against the gold standard. Probably easiest for some of us to get a hold of these issues if we recall that The Wizard of Oz was written in the 1890s as a populist parable. Frank Baum was a South Dakota populist sympathizer, and in his parable, you have the Tin Man is the industrial worker, the Scarecrow is the farmer. The Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, the great orator who runs away at the hint of trouble. And of course, Dorothy wearing her silver slippers and following the Yellow Brick Road is a reference to the monetary controversy of the late 19th century, whether to use silver or whether to use gold. The Emerald City, of course, is Washington, D.C. The Wicked Witch of the East is the banks. The Wicked Witch of the West is, drought and pestilence with the flying monkeys. And I could go on and on. But you can see, again, those sort of classic images, that distrust of concentrations of power that is central. And you see that, in a contemporary cartoon, strongly echoed in images from our own time. The populist movement, in a sort of formal sense, petered out in the 1890s and sort of rolled in some respects into the Democratic Party. But I think, more accurately, the social movement it represented really went off in a number of different directions. You could find these concerns and anxieties in the origins of the modern labor movement. You could find them in local patterns of radicalism. You could find them in the Prohibition movement, the sort of movement for social reform. And you could find them in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, particularly strong in the upper Midwest. The next moment in history that I want to touch on is the 1930s, where again I think you get these sort of characteristic concerns coming to the fore. Not surprisingly, in the context of the Great Depression, you have mass movements of the unemployed and of workers. One of the first of those protests, pictured here, is the Bonus Army March of veterans who came up with the idea as a response to the Great Depression to be paid immediately a veterans bonus that they had been promised that was set to be paid, I think, in 1945. The idea was pay it now and you'll snap us out of the Great Depression. This was a sort of Occupy-like encampment in Washington, D.C. and in smaller encampments elsewhere. And the end of the saga, echoed some of the crackdown on the Occupy movements in Oakland and elsewhere, with the burning of the camp outside of Washington, D.C. in late 1929. Other populist currents of the 1930s included, of course, as we've seen, the origins of the modern American labor movement, but also more purely populist movements, including Huey Long's Share Our Wealth movement. Long was a senator from Louisiana. And Dr. Francis Townsend's old age pension movement, something which ultimately forced the administration's hand in passing Social Security. But perhaps most representative of this group was the radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who had an audience of about 30 million at its peak in the mid-1930s. Coughlin was, he was a curious character because he sort of changed his tune over the course of the 1930s. He was, in one respect, sort of echoed what you might hear, at the Occupy movement. He said in 1933, for example, "We are determined once and for all to attack and overpower the enemy of financial slavery, to oppose and defeat those who still support the ancient heresy of concentration of wealth in the hands of a few." But, he was also one part Ron Paul. By the end of the 1930s, he'd adopted a very sort of rigid, almost conspiratorial view of the monetary system, and saw Roosevelt in the back pocket of both Kremlin and Jewish bankers at the same time. I think this is very sort of evocative of the opposition to the New Deal, which, at various times was accused of being socialistic, of being king-like, of being fascist. In this pain, it's a charge of fascism coming from the conservative Hearst newspapers. This cartoon is from the Daily Worker of the same year. So you get a sense of sort of convergence on these themes, if for very different reasons. And of course, we see much the same imagery used in opposition to the current administration. Likening Obama you've seen the signs that show him as Hitler, but also that see him as this sort of leading edge of a communist revolution. Again, I think bound together by that suspicion of concentrations of power. And that comparison, I think, is even more evocative if we look at just some pairs of editorial cartoons. So first from 1937, here's New Deal tyranny as a Trojan horse, and here 2011, virtually exactly the same image. under somewhat similar circumstances, that is, somewhat dramatic growth of government in response to an economic crisis. Here we have, that concern about uncertainty in business as a result of government activism. Here from 1936, here from 2010. Here Uncle Sam is bound down by, and these ribbons and ropes are all labeled with various, the acronyms for New Deal agencies. So, very much a sort of government violation of those core founding principles. Not quite as prosaic, but a similar message here. Sometimes, of course, in invoking the we the people, it's the taxpayer who's shown as the forgotten man or woman. Here again from the New Deal and from our own time. And at the same time, you get those cross-cutting images, not necessarily of oppression by large government, but oppression by financial interests. So here, from very early in the Depression, the rule of thumb of the moneyed interest, which Roosevelt early on, when he came to power, railed against. And here again, from our own time, it's Wall Street that's on the back of the taxpayers that's sinking the market. The next episode I want to touch on is the post-war era, which sees really sort of diverse strands of populist anxiety. Most dramatically, of course, in the profusion of anti-communism, of a fear of totalitarianism that comes in the wake of the war. In many respects, the fight against the Nazi menace is easily transported into a very similar set of fears about totalitarian government from the left. In fact, one interesting element here, many of the pamphlets written against national health care in the 1930s used the Nazis as an example. And those same pamphlets were reprinted in the 1940s with Nazi taken out and the Soviet Union edited in. Seen again as largely the same threat. A sense of profound conflict abroad, suspicion of foreign forms of government, and often sort of very conspiratorial sense of danger at home. A little bit later in the post-war era, of course, we get a different kind of popular movement, the New Left, which flourished on college campuses beginning in the early 1960s. Initially aiming its attention at forms of inequality, at participation in the voter registration drives in the South, but gradually focusing more and more, and some would say distracted by, the fight against the Vietnam War. We see in the New Left a conviction that sort of corporate values have overtaken social institutions, including the mainstream political parties, including universities. Many of the early campus-based protests were about the way in which the universities were run and not about any outside issues. And what ran through this period of the New Left, which I think is a sort of direct link to the Occupy movement today, is an intense concern with democratic process and democratic form. The New Left coined the idea of participatory democracy, which, in one respect often meant, as one SDSer put it at the time, that the issue is not the issue. It doesn't matter what decision you come to as long as you have a really good meeting. The means were as important as the end, in other words. And we see that in some respects in the Occupy movement, which in its fascination with sort of small experiments in democratic process and a relative lack of concern with, a list of demands or solutions. Now, the popular movements of the post-war era dissipate and fragment somewhat. And they go off in some sort of interesting directions. Certainly, veterans of, white veterans anyway, of the New Left lament the sort of splintering of that movement into the Black Power movement, into the feminist movement, into very sort of local environmental movements, and of course into the broader counterculture that just sort of runs off in a number of different directions. Similarly, the post-war right has a number of different sort of fragments that it both fragments into and picks up on. Part of that is the response to the civil rights movement, both in the South, but also when you start forced busing in the North. Part of that is the sort of rise, the appeal to what both Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon characterized as a silent majority, those law-abiding Americans who were sort of disgusted by the excesses of the 1960s. Part of that comes in the sort of Sun Belt revolution. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The uprisings in the 1970s and 80s against local taxes. So this is Howard Jarvis of California, very much the inheritor of a sort of Barry Goldwater brand of conservatism coming out of a particular region of the country. And of course the emergence in response to both the Equal Rights Amendment and the Roe v. Wade decision of social conservatism. What's remarkable, I think, and what I hope we can explore more tonight, is the way in which, sort of loosely defined Tea Party and Occupy movements, the Tea Party emerging in early 2009, Occupy movement, about 14, 18 months later, has been the ability of those movements to marshal those fragments, to sort of bring those constellation of interest back towards a focus on sort of common goals, common anxieties, and common fears. And there are some, I think, broad similarities between the movements. Both in their own ways oppose what might be called the sort of crony capitalism, a sort of tight relationship between those in economic power and those in political power. Both are, I think, fed by frustration with the political process. And both, in their own ways, I think, lament the evaporation, the promise of the American dream, the notion that each generation can be more prosperous than the last. And both, I think, in very sort of classic populist fashion, and this, I think, is captured in the Tea Party's fascination with our founding documents, and in the Occupy movement's evocation of the "We are the 99%." Both have really sort of tried to pitch their message as a broad "We the people" kind of message. Now, I don't think that it does much service to either movement or to the historical record to argue that they have much in common beyond that. I think there are some fundamental disagreements over consequences and causes that we can tease out tonight. What I want to do, for starters, is show a brief video clip that tries to captures in some respects the sort of essence and motive argument of each movement. So the first of these, from the Organization Americans for Prosperity, for whom he will introduce himself later. We have the Iowa State Director, do you want to set this up just quickly?
Sure. This was the first major ad buy across the nation for the general election that was going against Obama to talk about crony capitalism with its ties to Solyndra. We spent over $300,000 here in Iowa, and I think close to $8 million throughout the nation, and it forced the Obama campaign to respond with an ad for Rome.
Okay. So again, and we want to use this both as a way of sort of setting up the discussion later, but also as an example of the kind of argument that is being marshaled here.
The true engine of economic growth will always be companies like Solyndra, We all know about Solyndra, the White House emails, the FBI raids. Solyndra investors raise campaign money for Obama. The government gives Solyndra $500 million in taxpayer money. Politics as usual. Within the administration, the company's potential collapse had long been discussed, knowing all along Solyndra would have to fire their workers. But Solyndra held off until after the 2010 elections. 1,100 workers had no idea they would be fired, but the Obama administration knew. All that mattered was the 2010 election. Optics, not workers. It's not about people, it's politics. Solyndra's workers felt betrayed. Today, 90% of Solyndra's laid-off workers remain unemployed. $500 million in taxpayer money, gone. And Obama said this was a model of jobs and growth?
Do you regret that?
No, I don't. Overall, it's doing well.
Tell President Obama American workers aren't pawns in your political games.
Okay. And then I want to pair that with and I'm just going to think I'm going to play the first minute of this. It's about 2 minutes long, but it sort of repeats itself. This is Robert Reich, who's a professor at Berkeley and a noted supporter of the Occupy movement, trying to sort of capture the essence of that.
You keep seeing images like these. Americans exercising their rights to free speech and assembly, but meeting police wielding batons, forced evictions, pepper spray, brute force used even against former police officers who are protesting, and elderly Americans. The First Amendment is being stood on its head. According to the Supreme Court, money is now speech, and corporations are now people. As a result, our democracy is being engulfed in big money. But when real people without money assemble to express their dissatisfaction with the political consequences of this, they're treated as public nuisances and evicted. The Supreme Court's rulings have created the public nuisance, opening the floodgates to unlimited and often secret political contributions from millionaires and billionaires. These millionaires and billionaires aren't contributing their money out of sheer love of country. Their political spending is analogous to their other investments. Mostly, they want low tax rates and friendly regulations.
Okay. So, if I had to boil it down to one thing, and I welcome, disagreements or subtleties from our panel once we assemble them, I think the issue for the Tea Partiers, broadly speaking, is concentration of political power. The worry is concentration of political power. And the conviction that aggregations of political power corrupt our economic institutions. That very idea of sort of crony capitalism. For the occupiers, I think while the core problem is similar, the issue is concentrations of economic power and the conclusion that it's those concentrations of economic power which are corrupting our political institutions. So, what I want to do now is turn to the panel. It's going to take like 3 minutes for us to sort of reassemble, set up the microphones, switch the computer over. So you can take a quick break, nip out if you want to get a drink, and we'll get started at about 5 after. Okay? So I've asked each of our panelists to speak briefly, and rather than have me go through introductions, I think part of their spiel will be an introduction of themselves and how they got involved in the kind of political engagement that they're involved in. So we'll run across the table in the order we just decided on, and then open it up for questions. Deb?
Great. So I'm first. Hi, nice to see you all. My name is Deborah Thornton. I live here in Iowa City. I work for the Public Interest Institute, which is a free market, limited government think tank based out of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. And we have been in existence for about 15 years. So I'm a policy researcher and writer for them. It's very nice. I work out of my home, and my hours are my own, so it's a wonderful, wonderful arrangement. Often I'm in the Daily Iowan and the Press Citizen as part of their writers group with my articles. My personal background, just to give you that nickel version, is I have a bachelor's in journalism, political science, an MBA in marketing from the University of Maryland, and have worked both for the federal and state government, as well as being a private business owner for 30 years now. So just give you that nickel overview. One of the things that I wanted to mention was taking from Professor Gordon's historical comments and taking us back even one step further in terms of representing the Tea Party movement, to make that I'm sort of representing the Tea Party movement. To take it back historically one step further to the very foundation of how we were started and the idea of political dissent, political disagreement. That back in the 1700s, pull my numbers so I know what I'm talking about, 1765 was really the start of when, before the Declaration of Independence, the Stamp Act, which was an act imposed by the British government saying that every piece of paper used for any kind of business or official action in the colonies had to have a stamp on it. Had to be paid in gold, not paper money. Had to be on newspapers, flyers, brochures, land titles, deeds, and you actually could be put to death, according to the British government rule, if your official papers did not have the stamp tax on them. So this was a very heinous sort of strong-arm technique. It was a huge failure. They followed this up, of course, with the tax, the tea tax, right? And I don't know how much you guys know about the tea tax. The tea tax was crony capitalism at its earliest stages. It was a deal that the British government made with the East India Tea Company. Because the colonies were over here, we were becoming more populous, becoming more independent. We had people that were going out with their boats getting tea, bringing it back. The East India Tea Company was on the verge of going out of business. They were too big to fail. So the English government cut a deal with them so that they paid the tax on the tea in India, in Southeast Asia, where they picked up the tea. So the tax was already folded into the cost of the tea, so we didn't know what we were paying. Then they allowed the tea to skip going to England and come directly to the colonies, so there was no middleman and there was no additional tax and cost added there. And then the English government allowed the East Indian Tea Company to keep a third of the tax for their own purposes. In addition to that, they gave them £1.4 million as a too-big-to-fail tax government bailout at the time, even though they didn't call it that. So we had the Stamp Act, which was a huge failure, followed by the tea tax, which was the huge failure, and the Boston Tea Party. And those two things were what led, to the revolution, to the Declaration of Independence, to the we are endowed with our Creator, by our Creator, with certain unalienable rights. Okay, so those are the two main things that sort of led us to where we are today, 200 and some years later, right? So they were the very early exhibition of crony capitalism, of too big to fail, of favorable tax policies for one company that harmed everyone else. So it's interesting to see that these same issues are the ones we're dealing with today and what we're trying to address today. One other thing that I wanted to put in as we discuss this, and why this class is, I think, really important, and why our being here is really important, for the last 5 years they've done surveys. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I know all this stuff because this is what I do every day, have done studies on how much people know about our government and our country and about civic engagement, about this history and about where we're going and what we're doing. And they administered a 60-question, multiple guess exam, right? 28,000 college freshmen and seniors from 80 colleges. So a very broad range of this. The average freshman, as well as the average senior, after 4 years of learning and hopefully being in classes like this, failed this exam 3 years in a row. The average score was 54%. Some of these students graduating from college didn't know the difference between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. They didn't understand the concept of federalism. They failed miserably at this. I mean, 54% is not a good score. So one of the things that this group has done, and one of the things that kind of motivated me to say yes and say I would come tonight, is they're really promoting the idea that for you guys, most of this being students, over 18 but under 25, as well as those of us who are over 40, have to know this. We have to know this. We have to understand our history. We have to understand the systems and the cycles, just like you were saying, Professor Gordon was showing, the cycles of how this goes. We have to know this, we have to understand this, and we have to be out there and participate in order to make a difference and to support our country and to keep our country going. So anyway, thank you for inviting us and having us, and we look forward to your questions.
Hi, I'm Lisa Bonner. It's the first time I've ever been on a panel, so if I start stammering, please don't laugh. So I'm a member of Occupy Iowa City. I'm also a student here at the university. I am studying the geography of social change with a minor in gender, women, and sexuality study and a certificate in human rights. So you can see why Occupy might interest me. I had been watching and reading for years and years about the great wealth disparity in this country and how it's getting worse and worse. And it always, always affects the poor people first. And I kept wondering, when are the American people going to get out of their houses and into the streets? And I was always telling people, it will not happen until their microwaves and Xboxes are taken away from them. And that's what happened. People are losing their jobs. People are losing their homes. It's finally hitting the middle class now. And that is why people are getting out in the streets more. In Occupy Iowa City, when we first started out, it was really warm and nice and beautiful. We had a lot of people and we had a lot of students. As the time has gone on, it's the older people who are still like plugging away and planning for a big comeback in the spring. So we kind of expect all of you guys to come out with us again in the spring. What else do I want to say here, Mauro? I'm sure I don't really have to say a lot because you guys have a lot of questions. I do want to say, you know, he was mentioning the participatory democracy, and the format that we use was actually developed in feminist circles. And when I have to tell you this because one of the things that we do when we are in our General Assemblies is if we agree with something, we do what's called twinkles, or there are many different names for them. But when I came back to school this semester, I'm finding myself doing this in class and having people behind me laugh. So if I know a couple of you are in my classes, please don't laugh at me. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, my name is Mark Lucas, and I'm very happy to be back here in Shambo. I actually took a couple classes here. I graduated from Tippy with a BBA in Business Management and a certificate in Entrepreneurial Management. So it's great to be back here. And it's really good to kind of have an academic discussion in a nice setting like this where we can get beyond the yelling, the shouting, and the 10-second cable news bites and really be able to learn more about each other's movements and tell you guys where we're coming from in our movements. My dad, when I was a young boy, he told my sister and I, he shared with us a quote from President John F. Kennedy that said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." He made it imperative to my sister and I, at some point in our life, we've got to serve our country. I think he expected me to do it later on in life. When I was 19, I ran for city council in Wilton, Iowa. Just 3,000 people, farm town, a few minutes outside of town. I was elected. A couple years later, I was appointed as mayor pro tem and really enjoyed my time at the city council, where the rubber really meets the road in local civic politics. Also, 9/11 happened, and it completely changed my life. Growing up in high school, I was a three-sport athlete, loved my country, but didn't expect that I was going to join the military. And then that morning completely shifted my mindset. So I decided to enlist in the Iowa Army National Guard. I'm currently a first lieutenant. I just got back from Afghanistan in July. I'm an Army Ranger. I served on the Afghan-Pakistani border and fought the Taliban, which gave me a great world perspective, especially on different types of government. And a lot of times I was a diplomat, I was a killer, I was a city councilman, and I really tried to work to make that place better. So when I came home, I had a decision to make. I had a lot of money in the bank, wanted to spend some time with my wife, Cynthia, and just kind of figure out, was I going to go get my MBA? Was I going to go back full-time in the military? Or was I going to go back into politics? When I was in college, I was the Iowa State Director for the Americans for Fair Taxation. I ran the 2008 Fair Tax primary campaign here in Iowa. I also gave them consultation down in South Carolina and Florida, and I really enjoyed it. I was approached by somebody that said, you should interview with Americans for Prosperity. And I wasn't completely sure that I wanted to get back into politics, since I enjoyed what I did over in Afghanistan. I felt like my work over there was really important. I felt like it would be hard to replace meaning in my life after I did something so important. I interviewed with them. I really appreciate what they were doing across the country. And Americans for Prosperity is it's a non-profit, nonpartisan organization that's got chapters in 34 states. We've got 2 million activists, and we just brought the first chapter here in Iowa. After watching the advertisement, you're probably wondering, well, how can these guys be nonpartisan? They're just going after Obama. What we focus on is policy. We're not going to say Congressman John Smith is a deadbeat dad. He doesn't pay his child support. We're not going to say that. We're going to say Congressman John Smith voted to raise taxes. Call him and say, please do not raise our taxes anymore. With that ad, we're talking about crony capitalism. So if you're a Republican and you're in a pretty tight race and you don't vote for property tax reform this legislative session, I'm going to write an op-ed. I'm going to do radio advertising. I'm going to go after you. Because my goal with AFP here in the state of Iowa is to try to make Iowa more conducive to economic development. You know, in Iowa, I think we got about 5%, a little over 5% unemployment rate. I think we can do better. I think that every single one of you guys deserve to have a job here in the great state of Iowa if you want to. So that's part of my goal. Very happy to be here again. I hope that we can have some back and forth. I really look forward to learning more about the Occupy movement, because it kind of really started growing when I was down at Fort Benning and I was over in Afghanistan. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, hey, my name is Mauro Hack. I've been in this town longer than most of you, if not all, but most of you have been alive. 83 is when I came here for college. I spent 2 years in Des Moines, Iowa, where I learned English. And the reason I came from Brazil to here is because me and the military dictatorship were not getting along very well. So a professor of mine approached me and said, I think you should just leave for a while. Like, go somewhere. It's like, where? It's like, out of the country, you know. Okay. So I came to good old Iowa. I had some connections through Pioneer Hybrid Seed Corporation and learned English at the Des Moines Area Community College. But I was already a radical when I came to this country, and I've been here. Now I got a small business, 3 kids, one of them who is a junior and maybe in class with some of you folks. I'm a photographer. That's what I do. And I've been photographing leftist movements wherever I am. And I have nothing to hide. I'm left of center, probably left of the left. And that's what that's what I believe. You got to believe in something. It doesn't matter what it is. You got to believe in something and take action. You know, like Mark. Mark believes in what he does, and he took action. He went to Afghanistan. I commend that. Do what you believe in. You got to believe in something. That's the only way you are going to bring results. And you shift. You know, you shift. Nobody's got the final word on the right, on the left, or center. Everybody learns with everybody, and you have to change with times. As times, you know, I don't do Twitter, but I do Facebook. How many of you do Facebook here? Yeah. Just about everybody, you know. So I haven't quite caught on to Twitter, but maybe there's hope. There's hope. Anyway, in the mid-'80s, I spent a lot of time in Central America photographing wars, you know, a lot of, you know, learning how to deal with the military there and the leftist peasants and guerrillas, and always keeping, you know, that balance. You know, where are you? Knowing the people, knowing the language helps. Go, learn, you know, catch up a language if you get a chance. But Occupy attracted me in that sense initially And then when you couple the love of photography, which is what I do, although today I photograph high school seniors and do photography for the university and many other things. Postcards, some of you might have bought some of my postcards. But anyway, the Occupy has something in particular that I have never in this country, in my 30-plus years here, seen a demonstration of democracy as much as I have seen in Occupy. As a matter of fact, I hope you find this statement radical. This country is not a democracy anymore, not on the national level. Money on both sides, right, center, and left, has taken over politics in this country. I believe in local governments, in state governments, there's a lot of democracy there. But when it gets to, senators and a lot of congressmen and presidents, there is no more democracy in this country, and the people have to take it back. The people on the right, the people on the center, the people on the left, everybody should be working towards that goal. And in some ways, I think Occupy is doing some of that. And I believe the Tea Party, in some ways, is doing some of that. So I think, believe in something, grow, read. And as Debbie said, history is crucial. How many people here know why the Iowa Book and Supply has those funny small windows? Very few hands, maybe 10. Well, here's why. In the 60s, late 60s, they had nice big displays, like, big stores. Well, those are all smashed in and broken, and that's why they sort of made them really tiny so that people could not do what they did back then. And how many people here know that in 1984, and I was part of this, one of the 176 people arrested was shut down the university because the U of I had $2.3 million invested at the apartheid government, or their institutions. So the UI at that time, $2.3 million today is not a lot of money in a lot of people's eyes. Not when you're talking about, millions and millions just being raised in a primary election. But at that time, $2.3 million was a lot of money, and the university would not divest. They only divested after we took over the whole Jessup Hall, just shut down the whole university, filled up the jails, and that's what did it. I don't recall the details, but shortly after that, the university decided that, yes, we're going to divest from South Africa. So sometimes it takes people being a little bit uncivil, being arrested, do whatever they believe in for a cause. So believe in something, and be glad to share your comments and questions. Thanks.
Okay. Floor is open. Don't be shy. I'm reading your questions as they scroll here. They're good questions, a lot of common themes. Yeah.
Explain to us the meetings that we have at the Green Park.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what.
College Green. What are the meetings? What are they about?
Okay, those. The question was, what are the meetings that we were doing at College Green? We are actually having our meetings, which we call General Assemblies, at the Peace Center right now. What we do when we're there is first we decide on an agenda. What is important for us to talk about this week? And we actually do it twice a week. Then we go through our hand signals, if you agree, if you disagree, if we're getting off topic, or if you really hate it. And then we go through our agenda, and everyone has a chance to speak. what's great about our General Assemblies is that those conversations can get really heated sometimes. But after it's over, we all still get along. And I just have never been in a place that was like that, that people who are so passionate that they can just be yelling 1 minute and then just be like, oh yeah, it was great seeing you tonight, you know?
And just to complement what Lisa's talking about, and what I was mentioning earlier as far as democracy, you know, it requires 90% to approve anything. So if we have like 50 people in the meeting and if 5 of them vote no, that means that that vote does not pass. So then you go back and try to discuss the issues and work things out and so on to see where people differ, just like, you know, most people do, to find a common ground to move something forward. So, but issues, you know, there's a lot of issues that have come up. Right now, for instance, people are proposing that a wet house be created in this city, a shelter for people who have alcoholic problems, you know. So, you know, that's just issues that we bring up.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
This is for the guy in the yellow tie. Sorry, what's your name?
That's fine, it's Mark.
You say that your group is nonpartisan. I actually went on your website, and what I really see is a lot of just kind of subjects strictly about the current administration.
Sure.
And I was wondering what kind of critiques you have for the current Republican nominees, and if you plan to put any of their issues on your website, or just mostly on the Obama administration.
Sure. Well, to let you know what our organization is really, how it's composed, you got a 501c3 and then a 501c4. The C3 is what we call the education arm. So we can educate people on, you know, how to organize at the grassroots level, how to write a letter to the editor, and then the C4 is what we call the action arm. So we can run those advertisements and things of that sort where there's got to be a call to action. So I'll definitely agree with you 100% that we have been focusing on crony capitalism with the Obama administration, but we cannot directly attack President Obama. We can say we do not support President Obama's policies, go to Americans for Prosperity. You always have to have a call to action, which seems weird, but with the campaign finance laws the way they are, we've got to deal with a lot of gray area. And that's why, you know, for me, I'm looking at what we're going to do here in the state of Iowa, and we've got a lot of issues here that I believe that we need to tackle to make us more attractive for economic development. And one of those is property tax reform. And there's going to be property tax reform is a really, really tough subject here in Iowa. And I don't know if you remember last session, the session went way overdue, and people were arguing about how we're going to fix property taxes, and nothing ever got done. For me, I don't care about if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. I care about the issue. And I think that we need to lower the commercial property tax rate so we can attract more businesses and also keep the mom and pop businesses in, you know, small town Wilton, Iowa, or Durant, Iowa. So we need to lower those. So I'll go after a Republican, I'll go after a Democrat. It doesn't matter for me. It's all about policy. And we found that if we focus on policy battles in the even years, or excuse me, in the odd years, it'll resonate into free market people getting elected in the even years. To, I guess, address your question about the Republican candidates, there's a lot of big government people there. You know, and I like every single one of them. I also personally like Barack Obama. I don't agree with his policies, but you know, Senator Santorum had a very good showing last night. He was a part of a Congress that spent an enormous amount of money under the Bush administration. And you know, I'm a conservative, and I love President Bush. I thought he was a great leader when it came to national security on taxes, but when it came to education, when it came to spending, he was way out of control. And there was also an Iowa congressman by the name of Jim Nussle that was the chairman of the Budget Committee, and he had the ability to stop a lot of reckless spending. It didn't happen. For me, it's great to be nonpartisan because I get to be an equal opportunity hater on people who don't want to shrink the size of the government, lower the burden off everybody's shoulders, and really try to put people back to work. So, you know, it's the topic of the day. Solyndra is a really, you know, big subject in American politics. Crony capitalism is what people are really starting to talk about in all the debates. And but it happens on both sides. If you look at major corporations, Microsoft, IBM, Goldman Sachs, these guys are contributing to both Republican and Democrat candidates. They're hedging their bets because they know that it doesn't matter to them who's in office. They want to make sure they've got some influence on whoever it is in office. And that's the unfortunate thing about politics today, and that's why I love working with at the grassroots level. I appreciate the people I get at the Occupy level, where they're finally in the streets, in the park, saying, hold on, wait a second. And now everybody's got to pay attention, because people are getting arrested, people are upset, people are losing their jobs, they're out of work, and now you've got special interest groups that are trying to take over the Tea Party, trying to take over the Occupy movement, when it's us here in the trenches, here in small towns across Iowa and across the nation that are like, hey, we just want you to cut spending, we want you to quit crony capitalism, and we want you to be accountable to us and not to corporations.
There's a question right up here in front of you.
Yeah.
I'm not a member of the class, but I was invited to come and listen in and sit in on this forum. And I've spent a lot of time watching the TV and trying to be informed. And I even did an internet search, which is quite an accomplishment for an internet TV. Went and tried to find out a definition of crony capitalism. I typed in crony capitalism in the Google search, and I got Crohn's disease.
Maybe it is a disease.
Definitions of crony capitalism. I would like to go down the panel's line, starting, I don't care which end, and give me your definition of what you think crony capitalism actually is, or crony capitalism actually is. You hear it on the news, crony capitalism. But nobody's really, the problem is nobody's really, I couldn't give you a definition of my life depended on right now.
I can start. And this is my personal definition, and definitions.
Speak up, please.
Yep. This is my definition, and definitions change throughout politics all the time, but capitalism is free market, where you allow, where there's winners and losers, and the market decides. My definition of crony capitalism is where elected officials choose winners and losers based on the influence from whoever's trying to dictate where they want to go. So, regular capitalism is out for the free market. Crony capitalism is people being paid to try to influence, and it's the government picking winners and losers, not the free market.
I agree with what he said. There you go. In addition to that, I would offer the idea that crony taxation, Tea Party standing for taxed enough already. Crony taxation is part of that crony capitalism, or part of the government picking winners and losers. I'm one that also supported the fair tax, looking at redoing the IRS, redoing our tax structure to make it flat tax, fair tax, whatever you call it. Some of the main ways that the government has instituted crony taxation, much like the East Indian Tea Company, we're all beneficiaries of here today, right? You get a deduction from your federal income taxes depending upon your income level for your college tuition. Your parents get an interest deduction for living in that house and paying that mortgage. You get deductions for the number of children you have. Deductions vary if you're married or not. All of those things were done by the government to do social engineering, to encourage what they thought were appropriate social circumstances in our country. More homeowners, more children, more education. Looking at it being taxed enough already and looking at a fair tax or a flat tax, I would go, no, I don't need that insurance, that interest deduction on my mortgage. I shouldn't get it. Nobody should get it. I don't care how much money they make. They shouldn't get that interest deduction. Children deduction. No, I don't think you should get children deduction. You had the children. You made the decision. You support the children. The government doesn't need to reward you for that. Education deduction for going to school. No, the government doesn't need to decide that you get special treatment for going to school versus the guy in the family sitting next to you who can't afford in the first place to send somebody to school. and so who don't. So I would look at the idea of not only the too big to fail and the crony capitalism giving people special sweet deals, I would look at the tax structure and the tax sweet deals that we all take advantage of. Not only the big corporations and not only the 1% or the 5% or the 10% or the 20% or the top or the bottom 20%. We all get favorable tax treatment in one way or another that the government thinks is right. And I would say we need to get rid of a lot of that.
I personally just would not use the term crony capitalism. I think it is a misnomer. But along that line, as far as influence in politics, I would think about things like the American Legislative Executive Council, which is a group of CEOs and legislators that get together, and these corporations are actually drafting legislation that the representatives are then introducing into their state senates. The other day it was it was pretty funny actually, because they're getting more and more blatant. The other day a representative in Florida actually put the bill in that ALEC had created, put the bill in without taking the header off of it, saying that it was actually from ALEC. So things like that, you know, if I were to use crony capitalism, I would probably do things like that, these corporations are buying politicians that are then making laws that benefit their corporations. It's like a big loop then. As far as taxation goes, I have to admit that I absolutely, completely disagree with you. I think that it is completely unfair to expect someone who makes $11,000 a year to pay the same tax as someone who is worth $25 billion. And any way you slice that, it's just not going to be fair.
In all honesty, I couldn't give you a fair answer either. If Google can't, well, I don't think I'm going to try. But I think I can give you a better answer to what I don't think crony capitalism is, and that falls into what you're leading to. You know, Warren Buffett, you know, if my secretary is paying, he says, 27 or whatever percent, why should I only pay 12 or 14% of taxes? Just damn not fair, you know. And I think crony capitalism gets into that, you know, people using the system to their advantage, you know. I mean, and this goes again, both sides of the aisle. You have extremely rich people who are already multimillionaires, many times multi-billionaires. I mean, I can't even imagine what $1 billion is. Why do I care whether I pay 14, 16, 18, or 20% of taxes? I think there's a lot of selfishness. The other day I heard a wonderful story. I believe it was on NPR. This industrialist in Australia who had over 1,500 employees, sold the company, he retired, whatever happened. To each one of those 15 plus 100 employees, he donated out of the bonus, whatever, he gave each one of them over $10,000. You know, that's what I call not crony capitalism. You know, I think if we had more of that, more of people pulling together, we would have less crimes, better schools. I mean, you know, people would just live better, you know.
I just want to put a spotlight on this because I think it's a very important issue. A few of you in your readings noted this, the line from one of the articles, this I think is the one you gave me, Deb, where the author says, the more active the government, the more the private sector will spend to have its say. And so it's really a question of where this begins. I mean, if you assume a certain level of sort of public sector presence, and then you can be concerned, as Mauro and Lisa are, with equitable access to it. But if your vision is a smaller government, then it's the activist government itself that's creating the opportunities for this sort of inequitable access to the system. So I think, you know, there's a core agreement here among, I think, everyone on the panel that the TARP bailout was bad public policy. But why we got that bailout, I think we start to have disagreements about the actual source of it.
This lady here in the front has been waiting for quite a while.
Okay.
Mara, you mentioned that at the federal level there are certain issues at this point with the level of democracy that we have in our country, because the current elections right now are not very democratic. They're, being bought in a certain sense. A lot of the candidates are paying far too much for these elections, or not the candidates, but the lobbyists are, and companies are paying to allow these candidates to buy ads, paying for them to basically win these seats in Congress or in the White House. So what I'm wondering is, for both sides, what is the Occupy movement, and on the other side too, what are, you talked about what some of the things that you're doing in your meetings, some of the projects that you talked about. What are those doing to kind of help start at the grassroots, working towards helping people and helping the country change that, or working towards a grassroots movement to bring us back to the place where we can get that democracy back? And you have the Solyndra ad that talks about, and you talk about this crony capitalism, but what does one ad talking about what a problem that's far greater than something that Obama may have done, something that's clearly, the Supreme Court has allowed corporations to be people. So what is that ad going to do when it's something that's clearly a far greater problem?
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to hear from both sides what possible solutions there are, because as a citizen, I'm frustrated.
That ad's a great ad, and those national ads do make.
If there was a question, would you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sorry.
What are you doing? What are we actively doing to change?
The question was in regard of they're having
doing to change?
too much money in politics in different levels, in national government and even more local levels. What is the right doing, and what is Occupy's vision of that, and what can be done about it? I can't speak for Occupy, and as a matter of fact, Occupy is a very decentralized organization. There is no spokesperson, there's no president, there's nothing. Everybody's the same, and that is in some way a way to bring everyone's voice to be important. But what I can speak is for myself. I think there should be a much more fair way in which money would be used, something on the lines of the European system, where if in your district, let's just pick some round numbers, there's 10,000 people or 100,000 people. For each one of those 100,000 people, you get an X amount of dollars to campaign, and the guy that is running against you will receive the same amount. So there's a fair, if I have a lot of money and I give it to you, you're going to have a lot of great advantages over the guy that's coming from nowhere. So there's just no fairness there. So that's my personal take.
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Just wanted to jump in. The opposite side of that is that often in the United States, the candidate with less money does win. We can talk about the big money that's going on at the federal government right now, on the federal level, and that's to be expected, that these people are going to spend a boatload of money. But often at the local level and even the state level, it's the person without the money who often wins. If you folks will remember, and some of our students may not, may be too young, but Mike Huckabee, 4 years ago in the Republican caucus here in Iowa, came in and was camping in people's bedrooms because he had no money. He did very, very well, and it changed the course of American politics, changed his life, changed his story. In terms of the Republican primaries that just occurred in Colorado, Missouri, and Minnesota, right? Where Rick Santorum won those. He clearly was the underfunded candidate. And I think I saw a number that he spent maybe $250,000. So he was the underfunded candidate, yet won overwhelmingly in all three of those areas because his message appealed to the people and he was able to get his people out. So money is not the be-all and end-all in any of these elections. That would be the point I would make. And then secondly on that, ask your question, how do you make a change? What are we doing to make change? You know, if anything, the Tea Party, particularly in Johnson County, is more diffused than Occupy is. We haven't held a meeting in 6 months, 8 months. There's no meeting on the agenda right now. Somebody will probably decide about the 1st of April that we should do something to protest on tax day, April 17th, and we'll throw out some press releases and some emails and call our folks and do something on the Pentecrest, and we'll get our permit first. And that's the way we work. What I would encourage you all to do is to do what Mark did in Wilton, winning a city council election at 19, right? 19, yep. Winning a city council election at 19. Get out there and run yourself. Support the candidates that you believe in. Work against the candidates you don't believe in. Write the letters to the editor. Go to the events, raise the questions, because if you just sit back and stay at home, and one of the studies that I've got says that the greatest deterrent to civic action in the United States today are video games. The study showed that. The people who did not participate sat at home on their butt in front of the TV, drinking beer, eating chips, and playing video games.
I'll take a beer.
So, you know, so get out there and do the work, and you can make the difference. That would be my message.
I'm going to answer your question on a more personal level. Well, first, I want to tell you that I can't talk for Occupy either, because I'm probably the most radical member of Occupy, and what I think should happen is not where the group's going to go. But what the next thing that we're working on right now is outreach to the southeast side. People over there are generally working class, poor. At this point, 48% of the United States citizens are considered low income. A lot of those people over there are working 2 or 3 jobs. They have kids. They have problems finding child care. There are just a lot of problems that really poor people face. What I'd like to do is get what the outreach committee has decided to do, is to get out there, knock on people's doors, talk to them, ask them to come to a community meeting, find out what they need, how can we help make your lives better. I feel that if you bring people together as a community, they will fight for that community, they will become more engaged, and it just grows from there.
I'll answer your Solyndra question and then talk about how you can get involved. Sorry about my Rick Perry moment there. I was trying to remember the question. The Solyndra ad is a good ad. National ads are very effective. The thing I appreciate about what we do with Americans for Prosperity is we also have a ground game. And one of my most passionate things is educating the grassroots on how can you actually bend the ears of these guys who are elected in office. I can tell you that if a couple of you guys call your state rep in Des Moines, they're going to be like, holy cow, people are calling me from back home. People don't do it enough. If they send a letter, a handwritten letter or an email, they'll pay attention. But if you show up to the state capitol and say, I want to see Representative Jeff Kaufman, I'm from his, I'm from his district, he will be there in a heartbeat. I remember I went to D.C. this fall to talk about veterans issues. I walked into King's office, Harkin's office, Grassley's office, and Boswell, and I think Latham. I said, hey, I'm in Iowa, and I want to talk to somebody. And immediately, people were like, oh, we got to go, we got to talk to this guy. So they're not used to just regular, ordinary citizens coming into their office. They're used to, and, I'd go in those offices, and you'd see high-power lobbyists with pins on from their different organizations, and they're living in D.C. or they're living in New York, but they're not from flyover country. So to get involved, if you get involved at the local level, you start having traction, and people start paying attention. And one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done in politics, and I've been blessed to be from Iowa and be able to to meet these presidential candidates and meet President Bush and do all the cool stuff. The most rewarding stuff I've ever done was talking about trash removal in Wilton, Iowa, having somebody call me about the snow not being plowed, because you're at the most basic level of government where you know that the decisions you make are going to impact somebody the next day, opposed to decisions being made, you know, in D.C. as a congressman, or if you're working for, you know, the EPA or what have you. Those decisions are going to take a while to replicate throughout the system. So for the young people, politics is very polarizing, and I can understand. You turn on the TV and you see my ad, and you're like, here we go again. Negative ads work, and my whole perspective is I'm not going to play two-hand touch while the other side is playing full contact and they believe the same thing. But you can make an impact, and you look at the status of our nation today isn't any more polarizing than it was during the Revolutionary War. You know, Americans, we're just gritty people that like to fight, whether it's the British or each other. We're scrappers, and you know, you've seen it through the display today with all the pictures and all the editorials. People like to say, well, it's more polarizing than it's ever been. It really isn't. I wish we could change it, but if you guys want to make an impact, it's at the grassroots level, the county level, and that's where you'll really start to see real change.
Hey, I have a question for you guys, since this is the first time I've been on a panel, but I have watched panels a lot. I noticed that we've only had like 2 or 3 questions, and we've been talking for a long time on each one. I'd like a show of hands for, I'm wondering if that's cool with you guys, or if you'd like to get on to more questions. So if you want us to actually talk for a shorter period of time and have more questions.
Lightning round?
Yes. Oh, I'm just curious, because... All right, we'll try to keep the answers shorter. All right, good.
Yes. This has been answered, okay? But my question was, and I'm thinking of Occupy, but maybe both groups. Can you specify your goals and your action plans? Or are there, or is it just so nebulous and individual?
The question is, can you explain your goals with Occupy? It's not. I think I wouldn't use the word nebulous, because that seems a little bit too vague. I think it's broad. It's broad in the sense that you want to encompass, you know, where the country is going, and you can't just, you know, focus on one item like Solyndra, or on taxes, or the poor, or the rich. I mean, it's pretty broad. So, you know, I think that's the best answer I can give you. And it's try to, you know, it's like getting a big bus with thousands of people and have everybody sort of represented in that big bus.
I'm going to let you go on. I'm not even going to answer.
Oh, sure. Sure. From the Tea Party or free market, libertarian, conservative viewpoint, we want lower taxes for all, and we want less government involvement in every aspect of our lives, from the federal to the state to the county, local, and city. So lower taxes for everyone, everywhere, less government action, less government control and involvement in our lives. Let the people run their lives. Let them make their money, let them spend their money, let them take care of their families. Let us be ourselves, and don't try to control us.
I am going to add something to Maurow's answer, because I realize that, well, we don't have big overall goals because we really feel like there are too many things wrong to have one goal. There are a few things that most people in Occupy agree need to be done. We need to create an amendment to take away the personhood of corporations and corporations' right to speak, free speech, you know, reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act, campaign finance reform, basically all those things that will get corporate money out of our political system.
I think it's pretty safe to say that both of your groups are sort of outliers as far as the political spectrum grows. the United States. So I was wondering what, if you see any sort of movement within either group towards, instead of just sort of going to the extreme and hoping like hell somebody will come along with you, if you have any sort of ways that you're going to be trying to recruit sort of the the middle of the road people, which, the bell curve is where most people.
And can I just add to that? It's a great question. If you maybe talk about how you position yourselves against in the party system as well.
Yeah, it was weird for me when the whole Tea Party thing started happening. I was in Fort Benning, and I was so focused on the military, I'd read briefly about the news, and I'd try to figure out what the Tea Party was all about. And to me, it was what being a conservative was all about. Another thing that they were saying really, I just thought that's how I always been. I thought that's how conservatives always thought. There was just such a huge backlash with the current system. But to recruit more people is based off ideas, and you're going to either go with us or not, and hopefully we can agree on more than we disagree. And I always like to think that we're a big tent, and the more the merrier.
Could you, before we move across, could you talk about your sense of how the Tea Party is positioned vis-a-vis the Republican Party in Iowa and elsewhere? Because I think it works differently in different settings. Either you or Deb.
Oh yeah. In my personal opinion, I think it's pretty mainstream Republican. I mean, we're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about lower tax burden. We're talking about less regulation. It all seems to go with the Republican platform. So I think it's like that in Iowa. You look nationally, maybe in different places, but boy, I mean, you look at like a place in Florida, the Tea Party's huge, and you look at even some more moderate states like California, the Tea Party's huge. So they might be more outliers in those states, but in Iowa, in my personal opinion, we're pretty mainstream.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the Tea Party issues and actions and involvement in Iowa has been pretty mainstream conservative Republican. So that's kind of where we fit.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I don't really want to answer that question.
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure. Yeah, it is clear. I mean, just by the way we're dressed, I mean, you can see who is who here. We don't even have to define for. And I'm all for dressing nice, but anyway, we are extremes. I agree with you. And I think there's room for everybody, and I think their criticism of a lot of things that are happening in the government now are fair. I'm not a big Obama flag waver either. But yet, I don't forget that, the person who got us into Afghanistan, where you unfortunately had to go to, and I commend you for that, were previous administrations. That building up go way back to some overlapping, passing the Republican administration back to, some Democratic administration. So I think there's room for everybody. I think the important thing is to participate, to voice your concerns at the level where you feel that you can fit in, whether that's at a community level, like these folks have expressed, or contacting your senator or congressman or whatever, but just be involved. I think the worst thing to do is just kind of sit on the sidelines and do nothing. Then I do not feel like you have the right to really make a big stake later on when things go wrong, when the shit hits the fan,
Bob?
I mean, I think I just want to jump in quickly. I mean, I think it's important to note that, the Tea Party's origins were, in regard to a Bush administration policy. And so there's a strong tradition, I think, on both sides, as there are in movements of dissent throughout American history, with just sort of bearing witness on fundamental principles and not budget. And, if other people come with you, fine, but if they don't, you'd rather stand on the principle than the person. Yeah.
Mark, you mentioned both free market and regulations. What kinds of regulatory powers would you give to the federal government?
Well, with regulation, you've got a balancing act. and you really got to look at the state of the economy. Right now, it doesn't make sense for the EPA to start issuing tons of regulation right now when a lot of businesses are afraid to enter the marketplace. However, we do have a vested interest in taking care of our environment. So really, it's kind of like a seesaw, and you can talk about that with like unions as well, where I think unions served a very important role in our country because workers were being abused. Now we've transitioned and we're living in a new era, and people understand workers' rights. Now we've went to the whole other side. It's a pendulum. There's no easy answer, but right now, with the state our economy is in, we shouldn't be looking at imposing new regulations that inhibit people from entering the marketplace. And unfortunately, the government stands in between a lot of good entrepreneurs and the next big idea, especially with tax policy, stuff like that. But also regulation on drilling, I think regulation on drilling is a big one. It's really horrible that we're paying for oil from countries that want to kill Americans, opposed to let's try to bring a pipeline from Canada and buy oil from an ally that's also our northern neighbor. So we've got to make some common sense decisions, but you got to look in the light of economics and what's best for the people. But I'll tell you, there is a role for government to regulate certain things, but right now we've got to be very careful with how we regulate the private sector.
The guy with the plaid in the back, he's been waiting for quite a while.
My question is actually directed to you.
Awesome.
About making a constitutional amendment, and then you said something about I'm not sure what you said after that. Something about a steeple.
The Glass-Steagall Act?
Yeah, can you just explain what those things are to me? Because I'm a little embarrassed to say really.
Okay. I think they can hear me without the microphone. Okay. First, about a year ago, the Supreme Court made a decision, it's called Citizens United in shorthand, that gives corporations the same rights as people, as if they were human beings, which obviously they're not. You cannot throw them in jail. When they gave them the right to be people, their money also became the right, it also became speech, which, as you saw up there, who was, anyway. So the amendment to the Constitution would overturn that. So the Glass-Steagall Act was a piece of legislation that separated investment banks that could speculate in the market from banks that hold your money and my money, and we get our home loans from there and things like that. I mean, that's part of what happened in 2008 was the Glass-Steagall Act and all these regulations were kind of thrown away, and although there was a lot of illegal stuff that happened too. But so they took our money and they were speculating with it. They also are, you can use money like 9 times, pretend you've got 9 times the amount of money. It's kind of crazy when you start looking into it. Was that it? Was that okay?
And then in 2008 came the housing crash, the type of stuff that led to the housing crash.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, with the housing crash, what happened was mortgage people who make mortgages, right? They're doing all these commercials. Come on in, but you can own a home, no money down, all this. A lot of the paperwork was falsified. They didn't ask for any evidence of income or anything like that because they were making so much money. And they knew that these mortgages were never going to be able to be paid back. If you're making $11,000 a year, if you're making $25,000 a year, you are not going to be able to afford a $250,000 house. I mean, there's just no way you can do it. So they knew that these mortgages were going to fail. But what they did was they sold them to another bank that then sold them to another bank, and they sold insurance on those mortgages, and then they bet against the insurance, betting that, so they won both ways. Whether the mortgages failed or they didn't fail, they won both ways. It made a lot of people tons of money, and it cost a lot of people their homes.
Very back row.
Both of these groups seem to pride themselves on being almost all-encompassing and welcoming a large range of kind of issues that they bring on. Is there a point where you think your movement becomes too broad and you lose your message, or do you try and bring as many people as possible along?
I'm just going to repeat the question for the recordings. The question is whether both groups are placing themselves too broadly, or eventually they'll narrow themselves down to try to convey a certain message.
Right. No, I mean, we're just staying broad. The Tea Party really is a very diffuse, unorganized movement, and clearly staying very broad, just looking at the core issues of taxation and government involvement in our lives. So that's broad, and that includes everybody.
I would say Occupy is really broad too. There's, like I said before, there's so many things that we see that are wrong that we can't focus down on one specific issue and expect to change things.
The young lady to the right, far right?
Yes,
Or,
you?
Yeah. Oh, gentlemen, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what I mean. Go ahead.
With a great number of differing issues.
I don't even see.
The Occupy movement, is it feasible to expect change?
A lot of issues. Is it fair to expect change? Yeah, I mean, one thing is for certain: if you don't push, nothing will happen. So you gotta get out there and push. You gotta pressure. You gotta get people together and apply that pressure. I think to some extent the Occupy movement has already had quite an impact, perhaps to a small level, but I already see some things, people using it, referring to it as the 99%, of course. But I think you gotta organize and you gotta push.
And there's already been change, or the four of us wouldn't be sitting here tonight.
I just want to say one thing, and that is that seemed radical and seemed like it was not going to change anything. But you right there with the glasses? You had your hand up? No? Okay.
The guy in the
No,
red.
I was talking about the woman with the glasses.
No, the guy in the red. No, that's
Okay.
the person
Professor?
just
If you're a
Okay.
if you're a second-time questioner, put your hand down just so we can get first
The
time.
guy, the guy in the red shirt.
Red shirt.
Yeah, Fred?
I just think I wanted to kind of make a comment and then see where you would go with this. I hear you all talking about there's so many different ideas, it's really hard to tackle one. There have been a lot of studies, the company I work for, and they're pushing this within our company to differentiate our brand from our competitors, is to look at what you're trying to accomplish, pick one thing, focus on that one thing, and try to get that through. My question is, at what point I can see different areas in which each side has started to focus on things, but we're still talking in very general terms. What kind of things, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, what point do you think you need to start focusing on certain things to try and get pushed through so we can make a more significant change faster, because we're still facing huge problems, I think we'd all agree.
Yeah, that kind of goes to the business question of, who are we, what do we do, and why do we matter from a marketing perspective. It's hard to do that in politics. And I've seen people try to, apply a business model to a political movement, and it's so hard because you got so many people that might not completely buy into the model. So maybe it's flawed there. I think the Tea Party, we pride ourselves in small government. So anything that appears to grow the size of government, we're against. So I guess if you needed to pick one, just hot rock to push forward would probably be that one.
And we did 2 years ago, the local Johnson County Tea Party folks, if people remember, there was a tax vote on May 5th 2 years ago about raising the sales tax in Johnson County. And even though people didn't give us a chance, we defeated it in the rural areas and Coralville, and it only passed in Iowa City by, I believe, 7 votes. And I made sure those 7 votes were changed if I'd have thought we'd had a half a chance of defeating it here.
You mean legally changed, right?
Yeah, yeah, legally, yes, legally. If I'd have thought we'd have been that close to defeating it in Iowa City. So, you know, we have made change on individual issues, and there may very well be other individual ones that come up soon. The gas tax. We're talking about increasing our gas taxes at both the state and I saw again today the federal level. So they're talking about raising the gas tax in both places, and that is not something we need.
There really is no answer for Occupy at this point. I couldn't tell you the answer. We're having a Midwest Occupy conference in St. Louis in a few months, and then we will, as far as I know, we're going to start having regional meetings and meeting on a national scale as well. Until those things happen, I mean, I talk to occupiers all around Iowa, but I don't I don't have a lot of contacts in, California or New York. So I can't answer your question right now.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, this is a little bit different than what Vietnam was. In Vietnam, everybody could focus on that, narrow, issue, and it was in some ways easier to pick on that. Now we got so much going on. I mean, we got corporations with all this money, voting and giving, and we got the housing problem, and it just goes on and on and on. So I think if you narrow yourself down too much, in some ways you also lose focus.
But, I mean, I think it's also important, and people have said this in different ways, that the issue of branding and focusing doesn't necessarily have to be linked to something you would accomplish. I mean, and I think in both respects, I mean, small taxes, inequality, they become central to the conversation. And it's not necessarily something you solve in the short term. But
the gentleman to the right. Yes, sir.
Briefly, I'd like to ask members of the panel, what caused the recession of 2008?
Greed.
That's brief.
I believe I answered that question with the mortgage crisis and how all that worked.
Yeah. You had so many issues compounded, but I think the biggest thing is that we had uncontrolled spending for so long, and it finally caught up with us when we had the housing. Well, the federal government spending.
And I would add uncontrolled spending at the personal level as well. Personal and federal uncontrolled spending. That personal uncontrolled spending, nobody broke those people's arms to sign those mortgages.
All right, I will respectfully disagree with the last 2 comments, because what we're talking about here is having a pot of gold right there, and if you allow me to put my hand in that pot of gold, and I'm first, and I can take as much as I want, I'm going to take as much as I want. That's what the average person out there is going to do, and that's what happened. A lot of greed, uncontrollable, people in power. The power of the banks has to be limited, and that's where I think, I mean, it's nice to talk about low taxes. It's nice to talk about small government, but who's going to build the bridges? Who's going to keep the hospitals? Who's going to, support the schools, the university? The seat that you're sitting right now has got tax dollars on. So it's nice to talk about low taxes, and I don't like to pay low taxes either, or high taxes either. But I think we need to have taxes. I mean, you got to face reality.
Real quick, did you have a follow-up too, sir? Yeah.
Reading a couple books, a couple authors had a similarity between the Depression, the 30s, and the recession we just went through. And in both cases, just before they happened, the American public didn't have any money to spend. And both of the authors said that both the Depression of the 30s and the recession of the 80s, of 2008, was caused because people didn't have money to buy our products that we made, and that's why people were fired. So reaction.
I could agree with that because people,
Why didn't they have the money?
they were spending out of their means because they were putting on credit cards. So that's what I would say is that they assumed too much debt. People assumed, hey, I've got a great education from the University of Iowa, got these student loans, I'm going to find a job. There wasn't one there. And all that was, there were so many different factors that contributed. But I agree with you. People did have money because they're putting it on their credit cards, and eventually it just started catching up with them.
And that's what the government was doing too, putting it on the credit card. That's what the government's still doing, putting it on the credit card.
Yeah, baseball hat.
But doesn't that kind of come back to the government, instead of kind of escaping government regulation like the banks or credit card companies, because they're related to people who sit outside?
Just because you have, the question is, didn't the banks and the credit card companies, allow or encourage this, is what you're saying basically, by offering the free credit, the loose credit?
Lack of regulation.
And the government regulation wasn't strong enough to keep them from doing that, right? Right. I would come back again, and I always will come back to the personal responsibility issue. If your parent says you can stay out till 2 o'clock in the morning, does that mean you push it and stay till 3? Or do you take the personal responsibility because you know you have to be at work at 8 o'clock the next morning to be in by midnight? It's that. So you're saying that the American people aren't able to make a sensible decision for themselves?
Backlash against regulating against predatory mortgage lenders. What's the backlash against that? What's the problem?
If a mortgage lender tells a person that's coming in for a home loan, yes, based on your income, based on the information that you provided to me, based on your income statement, you can afford this mortgage. It's not that individual's fault that they take their word for it, that they in fact are going to be able to afford that loan. This is a professional. There is a certain amount of, professionalism that is expected in this instance. And there is nothing wrong with an individual who is not a banking expert that doesn't fully understand every aspect of these 18 pages of a mortgage agreement.
And I guess what I would say to that is, I'd ask, okay, are we doing a 30-year or 15-year? What's going to be my monthly payment? What's going to be my interest? And they can tell me, hey, Mark, you can afford this. But then I can look at my income. I can look at how much food I got to pay for my kids. I can look at my car payment. I should be able to make a sensible decision. Am I going to sign the dotted line? Now, and
okay, and then after 5 years, we're going to go to an arm, and there's going to be a balloon payment, blah, 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 blah. And then on page 7, we're going to talk about this, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, and if I could and I understand, and if I couldn't understand it, and I'm not a banking expert, I'd go to a friend that was a banker, but.
Assuming you have a friend who's a banker.
Yeah.
I don't have any banker friends.
Yeah.
This is not saying you're in Chicago or in Florida or in wherever it is. This is not the instance where you're in a town necessarily where you know somebody.
Yeah. The guy with the Che Guevara shirt back there had his hand up earlier.
I think another example of a need for regulation would probably be better. The SEC wasn't able to regulate and investigate because they didn't have enough money from the government. And so what that resulted in is the whole Bernie Madoff scheme. And these individuals here, they made the right choice. I mean, everything looks legal, but because of a lack of government regulation, they were taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
What in your model would prevent that from happening? Another question is, actually that's it.
Okay. I wish we had a perfect model for every situation. Unfortunately, there's going to be some greedy people that are going to try to take advantage of honest, hardworking people. And that's the way it's always been throughout life. I think America does a pretty good job if you look at our republic, and if you look at the model that we set for other countries throughout the world. However, you're always going to find a chink in the armor, even with United States military. We're the greatest fighters in the world. However, there's people from the third world that are able to kill us every single day because they're looking at opportunities. I wish we could have the foresight to change everything. We just can't. And what we have to do is prosecute those guys to the full extent of the law for taking advantage of honest people.
And that's something that we never do if you have money. You can look at somebody who steals $50 from a convenience store and goes away for 8 years, and somebody who steals $4 billion and spends 6 months in the hotel prison.
The guy in the jacket here in the second row, did you have your hand up?
I just want to, before we move on, I just want to make a connection with what we were talking about last week with regard to the sort of common elements leading up to the two depressions and the role of the housing crash. I mean, I think, on the one hand, you do have, irresponsible use of credit, as Deb, I think, accurately described. That occurs, I mean, one of the problems with the sort of regulatory regime is what expectations you have, right? And if your expectation is of very little regulation, then the onus is on you to seek out the information to overcome those barriers. And I think part of it was a disconnect between the expectation of regulation and its absence. The other thing that's important is, in terms of the sort of commonalities, is important to recognize leading up to the collapse of the housing bubble, and we talked about this last day, that median wages and median incomes had stagnated, so people were tapping into their home equity in order to maintain a standard of living. And I think that's the connection between the collapse in the demand in the economy over a long period of time and the immediate sort of speculative crisis.
Yeah, the guy back in the you in the black jacket.
Yeah, from the Tea Party, if you feel that the Tea Party's preference for minimizing government involvement in our lives extends to social issues as well.
I can take that one. There's a lot of discussion on that. My personal preference is to keep the government out of our lives. Those who would take that to the farthest part, would include all of those social issues in that. That the government should not be in marriage in any way, shape, or form. That the government should not be in doctor-patient interactions in any way, shape, or form. And that's where I probably would personally come down. How that's being played out today is a different issue.
In the very back.
At the beginning, it's brought up that young people have a low level of...
Excuse me, would you stand up? I can't hear you very well.
Well, in the beginning, it was brought up that young people have a very low understanding of American civics. And there's also kind of a distrust, too, in government policy, its institutions. Have you ever thought that the Constitution as being the law of the land in school, maybe in Congress, is seen as theory? But when you walk outside and you talk to your local politicians, you don't really quite see, you don't quite see that. You don't quite see the rights and liberties.
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Well, I sure hope people don't think it's just theory. I mean, that's that.
No, I don't think it's theory. I don't think it's theory, but I think that there's certainly a lot of rights violations that occur.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think just to try and focus this. I mean, Deb brought up the sort of dismal performance on the civics question. Sure. The question is whether the people in power share that disregard. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's people who have different viewpoints. Like, for instance, most conservatives and Tea Party people find that document to be a document that's not a living document unless it's amended through legislation. There's other people that view the Constitution as a living document that changes all the time. You guys have probably read the Constitution. It's not an easy read. Not today, and it wasn't an easy read back when it was written. And there are a lot of people back during the colonial period that were like, we need some interpretation. We don't quite understand it. Politicians in Washington D.C. On almost every issue, you could have somebody say it's unconstitutional. Like the healthcare mandate, the individual mandate. You have people say that's unconstitutional. Then you've got the other 50% of congressmen and lawyers or whatever saying, oh no, it is constitutional. And then ultimately we've got to send it to the Supreme Court and have them decide. But you know, you do have lawmakers who supposedly carry the Constitution in their pocket and they'll whip it out. Unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle, I think the Constitution in their everyday life is not really applied.
I would have to agree with that. That the Constitution is no longer applied. Even our politicians don't know what is in the Constitution. Apparently, Michelle Bachmann said that the Founding Fathers did not have slaves. We all know that's not true. Also, December 31st of 2011, President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act that authorizes the military to work on American soil and detain Americans suspected of terrorism for an indefinite period of time with no due process, no charges, no phone call, no talking to anybody. These people can just disappear. American citizens. That's the country we now live in. And that is not what our Constitution says we should live in, right?
It's how can you misinterpret something of like life, liberty, and pursuit of property? Like, no one should be deprived of that without due process. What's so hard to misinterpret that statement?
Just to make a very last comment as things are wrapping up, it seems like a good part of our conversation. By the way, I think we had some really good, smart questions here tonight. We focused a lot on economy and recent political issues, but just to put things in perspective, I seriously believe that if Roosevelt in the early 30s had not taken the actions that he did to bring, you know, millions and millions of people back from unemployment with all kinds of public projects that still stand very strongly. Just up here at Palisades Park, you go up there and look at this beautiful structure. It's there. And I think what people do not realize is how close to the abyss we came in 2008. We were this close. Now we're still close, but if we had gone just a bit farther, the whole world economy would have collapsed, and there would have been nothing short of war just about everywhere. So just, you know, put that in perspective.
Yeah, the Apple computer.
Sure. I just have a question for you. And I mean, I'm a development major, so I tend to pick topics in general, but Deborah, you talked about how, you guys in general talked about how there will always be some Americans who are greedy and might take advantage of others. And you say it's like the people's responsibility to see through that and make good choices and things. But then you say you want government taken out of all aspects of an individual's life, including especially the economy. So what would you do to the people? How would you solve the problems that would occur? Get to that point where it's a little better.
Well, the government's fundamental role is to protect its citizens from enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, and that is the primary goal for the federal government. The federal government was not created to protect you when you get a home mortgage. It's not to protect you when you make an investment. So the fundamental role is that. Government's grown dramatically. I believe in personal responsibility. I was taught that at a very young age. And unfortunately, I could be taken advantage of, and it's going to be my fault. I might not be happy with it, but I've got to accept it. And I guess the bottom line is, let's get government out of our lives, and let's let people make their own decisions, and they need to be informed. And unfortunately, the government's grown so much and people are paying so little attention to it that there creeps in the opportunity to be taken advantage of.
Iowa guy, then you, and then you, okay?
Yeah, my question is towards the Tea Party. You talked about taxes and lowering taxes, and how you think that everybody should overall pay a lower flat tax rate. But we also discussed last week about how that is paid for by taxpayer money, and also the rising costs of higher education. If you were to take taxes lower, wouldn't that also require less money to be devoted to public education, therefore worsening the problem we discussed at the beginning, where students are not able to tell what their government is actually doing because they're not being provided the education?
Okay, Deb, I just got to put a pin in that. Let's put the other two questions on the table.
Okay.
And then give one more run through the panel. So the other two questions are.
Yeah, education money.
Okay, so my question was, and this is maybe not the exact example that you're using, but say you make a consumer decision to buy a product, and you believe it to be safe based on the advertising and the notifications by the company. You think you're acting on accurate information, it's important in the free market, but it turns out that that product does harm. And that's where regulations, I think, come in. They protect the consumer, the FDA, the EPA. Do you think that's an important role that they play, or do you think that there's less of a role in prevention and more after the fact, pursuing those individuals that violate the American people?
And there was one more, right?
Yeah.
My question was basically an extension of the other two. All politicians, all political parties talk a lot about the role of the federal government in protecting citizens from enemies foreign and domestic, but there's also a lot of rhetoric about equality, equal playing field, the idea that people can achieve great things based on their own merit. But in a society where there are huge income disparities, education disparities, health disparities, the playing field is clearly not equal. And if the government doesn't have the obligation to ensure an equal playing field, then how can we achieve like the American dream, I guess, put it in cliche terms?
Okay.
All those questions sounded like they were for you.
Sure. I guess I'll go with the first one, or the last question first. It's not the government's role to create an equal playing field, but hopefully the government can be small and can be nimble enough to allow people to make their own decisions, to keep more of their money, so they can make the best decisions for themselves. Now, America is the best competitive playground in the world, and you look at people that have come from very meager means, entrepreneurs that started, Apple Computer, Microsoft, Ford Motor Company, people that came from very little means to be successful. And for me, I'm very happy to be in America. I'd compete every single day, and I encourage people to compete entrepreneurially and let our government play a smaller role in their life. I think FDA was a question. I mean, that's one of the good, obviously a good regulation. And I'm not here to say let's eliminate all regulation. Right now, we need to focus on eliminate or not creating new regulation that would hurt the growth of business in our economy today. And then the last question.
Education spending. Education spending.
The way that we fund everything in the government comes from revenue, and revenue is taxes. So if we eliminate the current tax code and go to a lower tax, it would have implications all across the board, not just direct implications to education. But one thing you would see with, let's just say we eliminate the tax code the way it is. I'll go with the conservative estimates. I can't remember the number quite off the top of my head, but it's at least $100 billion a year is spent in tax preparation by individuals like us and with corporations. If we eliminate the tax code and make it simple and easy, you'll see reverberations through the economy, and it will have a huge lasting impact on how we can have access to education, to jobs, to anything in this economy.
And I guess what I would say would be three things, is the Constitution was designed and has been amended to provide equality under the law. That's where we get into the idea of the crony capitalism and the favoritism being, which is a lot of the Occupy issue being wrong, is that's inequality supported by the law or supported by the government. So the Constitution is supposed to provide equality under the law. It is not supposed to provide equality of result. You're responsible for the result. In terms of FDA and EPA and regulations, it's a balance. We talked about that before earlier. It's a balancing act, doing the things because we want to know that our food is safe. We want to know that the electrical system is going to work and not kill us. So it's a balancing act of the things to provide a fundamental level of safety versus controlling every single thing as to whether or not I shovel my sidewalk within 24 hours after the snow when it's a sidewalk that no one ever walks on. Okay, so it's a balance. And then the third part on the education issue is education funding has increased exponentially in the last 20 years with absolutely no positive result. We're teaching fewer children in Iowa than ever before and spending twice as much money with no positive result. More money will not make the difference. You are responsible for your education. I'm responsible for my children's education. If we do not take advantage of that, that is our issue. More money will not change that. If you don't take those children to the library every Saturday to get books, if you don't read the Wall Street Journal, if you sit there and play video games, that is your responsibility and your responsibility to your children. The government spending twice as much money on education will not change that.
Lisa?
I thought those questions were all for the Tea Party.
You want to say anything?
Well, I mean, I pretty much disagree with all of that. If anyone wants to, if anybody wants to talk to me about Occupy after, I mean, we're already late. If you have more questions or just want to talk, I'm going to be here for a little while still.
Okay, so before there's a rush for the exit, I want to take the opportunity to thank our panel. I thought your questions were great, and I thought for people of fundamental disagreement that this was a model of civil discourse.
Definitely.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.